The sun was a brass disk hammered flat against a sky of unrelenting blue. It offered heat but no comfort, light but no clarity. Eleanor Hart, who had once been called Nell by people who loved her, knew this with a certainty that had settled deep in her bones, as dry and fine as the dust coating her tongue. Her world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that. The cracked earth of the Chihuahuan desert met the worn leather of her boots with a soft crunch, a sound that had become the rhythm of her own fading pulse. She had been walking for a day, or was it two? Time had bled into a single, searing moment, the wagon train. Her last tenuous link to a world of order and purpose was a ghost on the horizon. A memory of dust and rumbling wheels that had left her behind when her horse went lame. They had promised to wait, but the desert didn't reward patience. It punished delay. In her pocket, her fingers found the folded square of her mother's handkerchief. The linen was soft. The embroidered violets faded to pale ghosts. She remembered her mother's hands stitching them, the scent of lavender and soap in their Boston parlor. It felt like a story someone else had lived. She pressed the cloth to her cracked lips, a prayer for a single drop of moisture that wasn't there. Her thoughts grew tangled, hazy things. She thought of her father, a railroad man swallowed by the very machine he'd helped build, his body broken in a trestle collapse. She thought of the shame that had chased her from Boston, the hushed whispers that followed when she dared to speak against a man of influence whose hands had not been gentle. That man's lies had cost her everything: her teaching position, her reputation, her home. Now, it seemed the desert would claim the rest. Her knees buckled, the brass sun spun, and the world tilted. As the gritty earth rose to meet her, a shadow fell across her face. It was cool, a sudden and impossible mercy. She blinked, and the shadow resolved into the shape of a man on a horse. He was tall, his shoulders broad under a dusty chambray shirt. A rifle rested in a scabbard by his knee. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, his boots landing softly. He knelt, and the brim of his hat shaded her from the glare. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of distance and caution. They were the color of whiskey, those eyes, and they held no judgment, only a quiet assessment of her desperate state. Water, he said. It wasn't a question. He unhooked a canteen from his saddle, uncorked it, and gently lifted her head. The water was warm, metallic, and the most glorious thing she had ever tasted. It trickled down her throat, a tiny stream breaking a long drought. It hurt to swallow, but it was the pain of life returning. He let her drink in slow, measured sips. He didn't ask her name or her story. The desert didn't have much use for either. You were either alive or you were not. He seemed a man who understood such simple, brutal truths. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice a low baritone, rough as worn leather. Nell managed a nod, a faint, jerky motion. He helped her to her feet, his hands strong and steady on her arms. She felt a tremor of her old shame, a woman alone, dependent on the kindness of a strange man. But here, survival was a currency that outranked pride. He lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing more than a sack of flour, then swung up behind her, his presence a solid wall at her back. "Hold on," he said. She wrapped her weak arms around his middle, her cheek resting against the coarse fabric of his shirt. It smelled of dust, horse, and something else, the faint, clean scent of pine. The world slipped away into a rhythmic sway, the creak of saddle leather and the blessed dark behind her eyelids. She woke to the sound of running water, not a river, but something smaller, a gentle gurgle like a secret being whispered. She was lying on a narrow cot, a rough wool blanket covering her. The room was a single space, built of sturdy, hand-hewn logs, the gaps chinked with mud. A stone fireplace stood cold against one wall. A simple table and 2 chairs sat near it. Sunlight, soft now, filtered through a single glass-paned window, illuminating the dance of dust motes. It was a place of stark simplicity, clean and ordered. The man from the desert sat at the table, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was a calming sound. He looked up when she stirred, his whiskey-colored eyes meeting hers. "You're at my cabin," he said, setting the knife and stone aside. "Willow Draw is just outside. That's the water you hear." She pushed herself up, her head swimming. Thank you." The words felt small, inadequate. Most anyone would have done the same. He stood and ladled water from a bucket into a tin cup. Asa McKenna. "Eleanor Hart," she replied, taking the cup. Her hands trembled. "My friends call me Nell." The words came out automatically, a relic of a life where she'd had friends to call her by that name. Asa nodded, accepting the introduction without comment. He moved with a quiet economy, never a wasted motion. He prepared a plate of beans and a piece of cornbread, setting it on a small crate beside her cot. The food was plain, but her stomach ached with a hunger that was almost painful. She ate slowly, feeling strength seep back into her limbs with every bite. He gave her space, turning his attention back to his work, but she felt his awareness of her, a silent, watchful presence that was not threatening, but protective. For 3 days, this was their rhythm. He would be gone for long stretches, tending to his cattle, she assumed, and would return with the dusk. He never asked about Boston, or the wagon train, or why a woman like her was alone in the desert. In turn, she did not ask about the sadness that seemed to live behind his eyes, or why a man like him chose to live in such profound solitude. His silence was a courtesy, and she answered it with her own. "On the 4th morning," he said, "you're strong enough to travel. I'll take you to Massilia. You can find help there." The ride to town was different. Nell sat her own horse now, a gentle mare Asa had provided. The landscape unfurled around them, no longer a terrifying void, but a place of harsh and startling beauty. The Organ Mountains clawed at the eastern sky, their peaks jagged and purple in the morning light. Massilia was a collection of low, flat-roofed adobe buildings arranged around a central plaza, looking as if it had been baked from the very earth it stood on. Asa led her to the largest building on the square, a cantina with a weathered wooden sign that read La Estrella. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of chili, onions, and brewing coffee. A woman with a face as strong and handsome as a carved saint and a crown of graying black hair braided with a red ribbon stood behind the counter. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, missed nothing. "Asa," she said, her voice warm but businesslike. "You look like you've been chasing strays." Her gaze shifted to Nell, taking in her worn dress and the lingering exhaustion in her face. "Marisol," Asa said with a nod. "This is Miss Hart. She ran into some trouble, needs a place to stay, maybe some work." Doña Marisol Vega wiped her hands on her apron and came around the counter. She looked Nell over, not with unkindness, but with a pragmatism that was its own form of compassion. "Trouble finds us all out here, one way or another. You can cook clean." "I can," Nell said, "and I can teach. I was a school teacher back east." Marisol's expression softened with a flicker of sympathy. "The school here is closed. The county has no money for a teacher's salary. But a body must eat." She gestured to a staircase in the corner. "There is a small room upstairs. You will work for your keep. We will see how it goes." And so, Nell's life found a new, precarious rhythm. She swept floors, chopped vegetables, and served meals to the dusty ranchers and laborers who frequented La Estrella. Doña Marisol was a fair, if demanding, employer, and her son, Tomas, a quiet boy of 19 with eyes full of unspoken questions, tried his best to practice his halting English with Nell. The town of Massilia was a closed book to her. She was an outsider, a single woman with no family and no story she was willing to share. She felt the sideways glances, heard the shift from Spanish to English when she approached. It was the same chill she'd felt in Boston, a suspicion that settled on any woman who did not fit neatly into the world. Her past was a constant weight, a fear that the same kind of trouble she'd fled would find her even here. All she wanted was a place to be invisible, to earn a wage, and to rebuild the shattered pieces of her dignity. A week after her arrival, a notice was tacked to the post outside the land office. A small crowd gathered, their voices a low murmur of concern. Nell, on her way back from the mercantile, paused to see what the commotion was. A man in a city suit and a bowler hat stood by the notice, addressing the small assembly. He was handsome in a polished, predatory way, his voice smooth and full of an easy authority that set Nell's teeth on edge. As the official representative of the El Paso and Rio Grande Railroad, he announced, "I'm here to clarify territorial land grants. A new, comprehensive survey has been completed. The waterway known locally as Willow Draw and the adjacent sections fall squarely within the railroad's right-of-way." A cold knot formed in Nell's stomach. She scanned the crowd and saw Asa McKenna standing near the back, his face unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest. The man in the suit, who introduced himself as Victor Legrand, unrolled a large, new-looking map. He tapped a manicured finger on a freshly inked line. "Any and all settlement on this land is, therefore, considered encroachment, trespassing. The railroad will be taking possession within 30 days to secure its water rights for the expansion." The murmur grew louder. Water was life here. A man's claim to it was more sacred than any deed. Asa stepped forward. The crowd parted for him. He didn't raise his voice, yet it cut through the noise with the sharp authority of a pistol shot. "That draw has been watering local ranches for 50 years. Legrand, my father ran cattle there before this was even a territory. There are rights older than any railroad survey." Legrand smiled, a condescending curl of his lip. "Ah, Mr. McKenna, your cabin. I presume homestead claims are a delicate matter, but they are superseded by federally chartered development. Progress. You understand. This map is the law." "That map," Asa said, his voice dropping lower, each word deliberate, "is wrong." The two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills, the polished agent of progress against the weathered man of the land. Nell watched, her heart pounding. She saw more than an argument over a stream. She saw the same unyielding power she had faced in Boston, the kind that could redraw maps and ruin lives with the stroke of a pen. She saw the quiet strength of the man who had saved her life now pitted against it. The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering, anxious. Legrand rolled up his map, his victory assured. As Nell turned to go, a gnarled hand touched her elbow. She looked into the craggy face of an old man she'd seen around the plaza, a man with pale, watchful eyes and the stillness of a patient hunter. His name, she'd heard someone say, was Ezra Pike. He leaned in, his voice a dry whisper that smelled of tobacco and dust. "Heard you came in with McKenna." Nell nodded, wary. "Don't you trust a map that ain't got no dust on it?" "Missy," Ezra rasped, his eyes flicking toward Legrand's retreating back. "That survey of his, it's based on an old military map. A bad one, I know, 'cause I used to scout for them. The landmarks are off by a good 2 miles, enough to move a stream from one man's land to another's pocket." He gave a short, humorless chuckle and shuffled away, leaving Nell standing alone in the brassy sunlight. The dust swirling around her ankles, she looked from the land office to the distant silhouette of the Organ Mountains, in the direction of Asa McKenna's cabin and the thin, life-giving thread of Willow Draw. The old fear was there, urging her to stay quiet, to remain invisible. But beneath it, something new and unfamiliar stirred a spark of anger, a flicker of resolve. The man who had shown her mercy was about to be erased by a lie on a piece of paper. And she, a woman who had lost everything to a lie, was the only one who had just been handed a piece of the truth. Ezra Pike's words had dropped like stones into the still well of Nell's uncertainty, and the ripples disturbed her days and nights. At La Estrella, The familiar scent of frying onions and the boisterous laughter of patrons offered a fragile shield, but it could not protect her from the truth she now carried. She watched the comings and goings in the Mesilla Plaza with new eyes, seeing the subtle lines of alliance and animosity. She saw Victor Legrand dining with 2 members of the town council, his gestures expansive, his smile as smooth and false as a gambler's coin. And she saw the worry in the faces of the small ranchers who came for supplies, their conversations dropping to whispers whenever Legrand's name was mentioned. Her hands would be busy kneading masa or scrubbing pots, but her mind was miles away. At a small cabin beside a stream, she felt useless, a bystander to a slow-motion theft. Doña Marisol, whose sharp eyes missed little, noticed her disquiet. A troubled mind sours the stew. "Mija," she said one afternoon, her voice firm but not unkind. "Whatever weighs on you, keeping it in the dark will only make it heavier." Before Nell could find the words to answer, the cantina door opened, and Asa McKenna stepped inside. He moved with the quiet purpose she remembered, his presence seeming to fill the room and subdue its noise without him saying a word. He'd come for supplies, but his gaze found Nell's almost immediately. He gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement, the corner of his mouth tipping into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close to it. After he'd settled his account with Marisol, he approached the table where Nell was shelling peas. "Miss Hart," he began, turning his hat in his hands, "I have a proposition for you." Nell paused, her fingers still. "My men, they're good hands, but their cooking is an insult to God and the cattle we eat. I need someone to fix meals. A real cook." He looked at her directly, his whiskey-colored eyes steady. "It wouldn't be much. A cot in the old line shack, a small wage, but it's honest work, and you'd have a roof over your head." The offer hung in the air between them. It was everything she should have feared, leaving the relative safety of the town, putting herself under the protection of a single man, and moving directly into the path of the storm Legrand was brewing. It was an arrangement that would set tongues wagging in Mesilla, but it was also a chance to stop being a spectator. It was a way to stand on the ground being fought for, to contribute something more than worried glances. She thought of Ezra's words, the lie on the map. She thought of Asa's quiet decency. "When would I start?" she asked. A week later. Nell was watching the dust of Mesilla disappear behind her as she sat beside Asa on the seat of his buckboard wagon. Her few belongings, including a precious handful of books, were packed in a small trunk behind them. Doña Marisol had sent her off with a sack of dried chilies, a hug that smelled of cinnamon, and a promise. "You send word if you need anything. And you make sure that boy Thomas practices his letters. His head is full of dreams that only reading can let out." The ranch was a small, rugged operation tucked into the foothills of the Organ Mountains. There was Asa's cabin, a longer, lower bunkhouse for his 3 hands, a corral, and a sturdy barn. The line shack he'd offered her was little more than a single room with a cot, a small stove, and a window that looked out onto the steadfast peaks. It was sparse, but it was hers, and through the open door, she could always hear the gentle murmur of Willow Draw, a constant, reassuring voice. A new routine took shape, measured not by the town clock but by the sun and the appetites of hard-working men. Mornings were for baking cornbread and putting on a great pot of beans. At midday, she would carry buckets of food and coffee to the bunkhouse for the hands 3 sun-scorched. Reticent men named Jesse, Nate, and Gus, who treated her with a shy, clumsy deference. But the evenings were different. After the hands had eaten, Nell would prepare a plate for Asa and carry it across the short distance to his cabin. The cabin became their shared space for an hour each night. The first few times were filled with a stiff silence. Nell would set his plate on the table, busy herself by the hearth, and wait to retrieve the empty dish, acutely aware of the impropriety that gossips in town would imagine. She was a woman alone, sharing the evening fire of an unmarried man. It was a tightrope walk between her gratitude for his help and the deeply ingrained need to protect what was left of her name. But slowly, the silence softened. It became less a void and more a comfortable quiet. The crackle of the hearth fire was its own kind of conversation. He would ask about her day, and she would ask about the cattle. He learned she was from Boston. She learned he had served as a cavalryman before buying this land. They spoke of small things, but these simple exchanges were like stones being laid one by one, building a foundation of trust. She saw the weariness in his shoulders at the end of a long day, and the way his eyes would soften when he looked at the mountains he called home. He, in turn, saw the determined set of her jaw and the quiet grace in her hands as she served his meal, turning a simple dinner into an act of care. The kitchen fire, first in her small shack and then the hearth in his cabin, became the center of her world, a symbol of the fragile community she was building in this wild, lonely place. One evening, Thomas Vega rode out from Massilia, a tattered copy of a newspaper clutched in his hand. Doña Marisol had insisted, after supper, by the light of a lantern hanging in the barn. Nell sat with him on a hay bale, patiently helping him sound out the headlines. He stumbled over the words, his brow furrowed in concentration, but his eyes shone with a fierce determination. Asa, coming to check on a lame horse, stopped in the shadows of the barn door. He watched for a long time, listening to Nell's gentle encouragement and Tomas's halting progress. He saw not just a boy learning to read, but a future being forged. He saw the teacher in Nell, the purpose that lit her up from within, a light he hadn't seen there before. Later that night, as she collected his plate, he spoke, his voice thoughtful. "You're good with the boy. He's a bright student. Nell said, he just needs the chance." "There are others," Asa said, looking into the fire. "My men. Jesse can sign his name, but that's the extent of it. They've never had the chance either." He met her gaze. "The old barn is dry and sturdy. There are lanterns. If you were willing, you could hold a class in the evenings, for anyone who wanted to learn." Nell's heart gave a sudden, sharp leap. It was more than an offer of work. He was giving her back a piece of herself she thought she had lost forever. He saw her not as a stray he'd rescued, or a cook he'd hired, but as Eleanor Hart, the schoolteacher. I would like that very much. Mr. McKenna." "Asa," he corrected her gently. The first class was a hesitant affair. Tomas sat proudly on a crate, while Jesse and Nate shuffled in, their face scrubbed clean, looking more nervous than if they were facing a stampede. Gus, the oldest hand, stood by the door, pretending to be interested in a piece of harness but listening to every word, on a wide plank of pine that Asa had sanded smooth. Nell drew the alphabet with a piece of chalk. The white letters stood out starkly against the dark wood, a clear and simple promise, as she pointed to each one, giving it a name and a sound. The barn filled with a quiet reverence. It was the sound of hope taking root in the hard-packed earth. Their peaceful world was fractured a few days later. 3 men on horseback rode up the draw, leading a wagon loaded with tools and timber. They were not ranchers. They were hard-faced men who moved with the arrogant efficiency of hired muscle. Their leader, a man with a scarred cheek, unrolled a document bearing the railroad's seal. "We're here on the authority of Mr. Victor Legrand and the Doña Ana Town Council," he announced, not even looking at Asa directly. "We're to construct a temporary weir, to measure the stream's flow rate for the survey." "There's no need to measure it," Asa said, his voice dangerously calm. "It flows the same as it has for a generation." The man merely shrugged. "Got our orders." Nell watched from the cabin doorway as they worked, sinking posts and piling rocks into the clear water of Willow Draw. It was a violation, a choking of the ranch's very lifeblood. Asa stood nearby, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. She could feel the violence simmering in him, a palpable wave of heat. She saw the ghost of the cavalryman, the man who knew how to fight, and she prayed he would not give Legrand the excuse he was so clearly seeking. To her immense relief, he held his ground, his anger a cold, contained thing. He would not be provoked into a fight he couldn't win. That night, the gentle voice of the stream was weaker, a strained whisper. The dam was working. Just after dusk, another rider approached. This one was different. A woman, sitting tall and confident in the saddle, a badge pinned to her vest. Deputy Ruth Calder had a plain, honest face and eyes that looked like they could see right through a man. She dismounted and accepted a cup of coffee from Nell, but her business was with Asa. Saw Legrand's men heading this way, she said, getting straight to it. Figured I'd check in. They're measuring the flow, Asa said, the words heavy with sarcasm. They're baiting a trap, Ruth corrected him flatly. And you need to know, the bait is all over Mesilla. Legrand's been buying dinners, making promises. I can count at least half the town council members who are now squarely in his pocket. That paper his man showed you, it's just the first turn of the screw. He wants you to get angry. Asa, he wants you to give him a reason to have you thrown off this land for good. She looked from Asa's grim face to Nell's worried one. Whatever you're planning, plan it smart. The law in this town is up for sale right now. She finished her coffee, nodded to them both, and rode off into the growing darkness, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. The warning hung in the air, as stark as the chalk letters on the board in the barn. The fight for Willow Draw would not be won with fists or fury, but with something else. And as the sound of the diminished stream trickled through the night, Nell knew their small, warm world, built around a kitchen fire and a fledgling school, was more fragile than she had ever imagined. Deputy Ruth Calder's warning settled over the ranch like a winter chill, sharp and undeniable. The temporary dam, a crude scar of rock and timber, was more than an inconvenience. It was a declaration of war fought with surveys and statutes instead of bullets. For Asa, the slowly diminishing gurgle of Willow Draw was the sound of a tightening noose. He saw the provocation for what it was, a calculated effort to ignite his temper, to draw out the man he had spent years trying to bury. He found himself watching his own hands, remembering a time, years ago, on a different patch of sun-scorched earth. Another dispute over a trickle of water. Another man, arrogant and sure of his claim, had gone for his gun. Asa had been faster. The memory was not of victory, but of the sickening finality of it all. The sudden stillness of a man who had been shouting moments before. He'd been cleared by a judge self-defense, they called it, but the verdict had never quieted the echo of the gunshot in his own mind. He would not let Victor Legrand turn him back into that man. While Asa wrestled with his ghosts, Nell fought with the future. She saw the simmering frustration in the faces of the ranch hands and the quiet fear in Thomas's eyes. She knew that waiting for Legrand's next move was a form of surrender. Armed with Ruth's grim assessment, she rode to Mesilla, her mind a whirl of desperate strategies. She found Doña Marisol in the cantina's kitchen, her hands deep in a bowl of dough. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and warm spices. Nell laid out the situation, her words tumbling out in a rush. Ruth says the council is bought. Asa's deed means nothing if Legrand can convince a judge his map is the only one that matters. We need to prove he's wrong. We need to prove that stream has always belonged to the people here. Marisol punched down the dough with a solid thud, her expression thoughtful. Words on paper are for men like Legrand. The memory of the people is written on the land itself. She dusted the flour from her hands. We will gather that memory. That afternoon, the three women formed an unlikely council of war. Ruth Calder, the law, spread a county map on a table. Doña Marisol, the heart of the community, provided a list of names old families, homesteaders who had been in the valley for decades. And Nell, the teacher, became the historian, her pen and notebook ready. Their work was slow and disheartening. They traveled in Marisol's sturdy buckboard to dusty adobes and weathered homesteads tucked into the folds of the hills. Fear was a palpable presence. Some doors remained closed to them. Others opened only a crack, revealing suspicious eyes and tight-lipped mouths that claimed to remember nothing. Legrand's influence was a long shadow, and many were afraid to stand in the light. But Marisol's presence opened doors that would have been bolted to Nell or even a deputy. She would speak in the soft, rapid Spanish of the valley, reminding people of shared histories, of children she had helped bring into the world, of droughts they had weathered together. Slowly, painstakingly, they gathered their proof. An old man, his skin like wrinkled parchment, pointed to a rock formation. The survey marker was always that one, the sleeping dog. My father showed it to me. A widow recalled how her husband used to draw water from Willow Draw for their herd, long before Asa's father had even arrived. Each story was a single thread. Nell wrote furiously, her hand covered in ink and dust, weaving the threads into a tapestry of truth. They were small truths, personal and anecdotal. Perhaps not enough for a court of law, but they were something. It was during a trip to the mercantile for supplies that Ezra Pike found her again. He seemed to materialize from the shadows between the barrels of pickles and sacks of flour, a desert tortoise of a man. He'd clearly been watching their progress. "Chasing ghosts, Miss Hart," he rasped. "I'm looking for facts. Mr. Pike," she replied, her tone more weary than sharp. He grunted. Facts can be brittle things. He glanced around the empty store, then reached inside his dusty coat. He produced a folded piece of paper, oilskin wrapped but still bearing the deep creases of time. It was yellowed and fragile, and as he unfolded it, a tear ran along one of the folds. Fort Selden, 1872. A patrol map, not official but honest. Nell took it with trembling hands. It was a soldier's map, hand-drawn, with annotations about grazing quality and hostile territories. But there, clearly marked, was Willow Draw. And the surveyor's landmark was not the insignificant rise Legrand's map indicated, but a prominent rock outcropping 2 miles to the east, the one the old man had called the Sleeping Dog. The truth was right there, in faded ink. But the map was torn, the paper brittle and stained. It was powerful, yet imperfect, a truth as frayed as the community it was meant to protect. "Legrand's got a copy of this, or one like it," Ezra said, his voice low. "Only his is clean, and his landmarks have moved. He's not just claiming the water, he's stealing the very shape of the land." He tipped his hat and was gone, leaving Nell clutching the fragile, tattered hope in her hands. Back at the ranch, the school had become a sanctuary. The nightly lessons in the barn were more than just reading and writing. They were an act of defiance. The simple plank blackboard was a declaration that they would build a future here, one that Legrand could not erase. The men's hands, calloused from rope and rain, were clumsy with the chalk, but their faces were alight with the pride of learning. The clean white dust of the chalk on their work-worn fingers was a potent symbol knowledge blooming in the harshest of soils. Legrand must have seen it as such. One evening, as Nell was guiding Jesse through the complexities of his own name, the barn doors were thrown open with a crash. 3 of Legrand's men stood silhouetted against the twilight, their faces set in cruel sneers. It was the man with the scarred cheek and 2 of his companions. "Well, look at this," the leader said, his voice dripping with contempt. "A little schoolhouse for the ignorant, trying to learn big words. Boys." Asa was mending a fence on the far side of the corral. He was too far away to intervene immediately. The men strode in, kicking over a crate that served as a bench. One of them knocked a lantern from its hook, and it clattered to the floor, thankfully extinguishing itself without starting a fire. Their target was clear. They moved toward the blackboard. "No real work to do. You gotta play with chalk," the man sneered, reaching out to wipe it clean. Tomas, who had been silent and frozen with fear, suddenly moved. He scrambled to his feet and stood directly in front of the board, his thin arms spread wide as if to protect a sacred object. "Leave it be," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "Get out of the way, boy," the man snarled, and shoved him hard. Tomas stumbled backward, hitting the board with a thud and falling to the dirt floor. He had protected the alphabet with his own body. That's when they heard the cold, deadly voice from the doorway. "That's enough." Asa stood there, a pitchfork in his hand. He wasn't holding it like a farm tool. He held it like a weapon, its tines gleaming in the dim light. His face was a mask of cold fury. The muscles in his jaw corded and tight. The man from her nightmares, the one she had feared, was there. The thugs looked from the pitchfork to the chilling stillness in Asa's eyes and seemed to make a collective decision. This was not the fight they were being paid for. "Just having a little fun," the leader muttered, backing away. They turned and vanished into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. Asa immediately dropped the pitchfork and went to Tomas, helping the shaken boy to his feet. "Are you hurt?" "No, señor," Tomas whispered, wiping dust from his cheek. He looked at the blackboard, where the letters were still intact, smudged only by his own shoulder. A small, fierce pride shone through his fear. Later that night, the anger had faded from Asa's eyes, replaced by a deep, troubled weariness. Nell brought him his supper, but neither of them spoke of the incident. The silence was thick with what was left unsaid. She could feel his struggle, the violence he was holding back, a dam of his own that was threatening to break. She returned to her small shack, but she couldn't sleep. The image of Tomas standing before the board was burned into her mind. He hadn't fought with his fists. He had fought with his conviction. And in that moment, Nell knew that they had been fighting the wrong way. Defending was not enough. They had to build. An idea, born of desperation and inspiration, began to form. It was a wild, audacious thought. She sat at her small table, pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her, and dipped her pen in the inkwell. The law favored progress, development, things that served the public, so they would give them a public work. She wrote 2 letters. The first was to the Honorable Judge Isaac Parker, the circuit court judge due to visit Massilia in the coming months. It was a formal petition. In it, she described the community of Willow Draw, the families who depended on its water, and the establishment of a school for the children and adults of the territory who had no other access to education. She proposed the formal creation of a permanent school and kitchen, a public trust on the disputed land, to serve the educational and nutritional needs of the area's laborers, a place of public good. The second letter was to the bishop in Santa Fe. This one was different. It spoke of faith and charity, of feeding the hungry and enlightening the ignorant. It painted the school kitchen not as a legal strategy, but as a mission, a small beacon of Christian decency in a harsh land, and humbly requested the church's blessing. She wrote until her fingers ached and the sky began to pale in the east. When she was done, she took the letters and Ezra's tattered map and walked to Isa's cabin. He was already awake, sitting at his table, staring into a cold cup of coffee. He looked up as she entered, the exhaustion of his internal battle etched on his face. Wordlessly, she laid the 2 letters and the map on the table before him. He read them slowly, his brow furrowed. He traced the faded lines of the map with his finger, then read the letters again. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the first tentative chirps of the dawn chorus. When he finally looked up, the storm in his eyes had passed. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of a different kind of hope there, a path that was not paved with violence. "A school and a kitchen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're not just fighting for the water, are you?" "Nell." "No," she said softly, her own voice unsteady. "We're fighting for the wellspring." He nodded, a slow understanding dawning on his face. He looked at the letters, then at her. He saw not just a plan, but the woman who had conceived it, her quiet courage, her fierce intelligence. She had offered him a new weapon, one forged not of steel, but of ink, compassion, and community. And in the soft light of the new day, he began to believe it might be the only weapon that could truly win. The letters to the judge and the bishop were gone. carried eastward in a dusty mail wagon. 2 paper prayers sent out into the vast, indifferent territory. An uneasy calm settled over the ranch at Willow Draw, the quiet of a held breath. Legrand's men no longer bothered the school, and the dam they had built sat ugly and insolent in the stream, a constant, low insult. The water level in the draw had dropped, but it still flowed, a stubborn artery of life. Asa worked with a grim, focused energy, mending fences and tending to his herd. His silence a wall Nell couldn't seem to penetrate. She felt him withdrawing, pulling back into that solitary place where he wrestled with his own brand of demons. The sky that morning was a sheet of hammered pewter, the air heavy and still. A strange yellow light bled across the horizon, muting the vibrant colors of the desert. Asa was planning to ride to the north pasture to check on a small herd he kept near the base of the mountains. And Nell, needing to escape the oppressive quiet of the ranch, asked to ride along. She told herself it was to gather herbs that grew in the higher elevations, a flimsy excuse for a need she couldn't name, the need to not be alone. He agreed with a simple nod, and they rode out together, the silence stretching between them. They moved through a landscape that seemed to be waiting. No birds sang. The usual rustle of lizards in the scrub was gone. Even the wind seemed to have died. They found the cattle grazing peacefully, oblivious to the strange light. As Asa dismounted to check a new calf, the first gust of wind hit them. It wasn't the usual dry desert wind. It was cold and carried the damp, earthy smell of rain. "We need to find cover," Asa said, his voice sharp with urgency as he scanned the darkening sky. "Now!" Far to the west, a bruised purple curtain of cloud was advancing with unnatural speed. He pointed toward a rocky outcrop a half-mile away. "There's an old line shack there. It's not much, but it's better than nothing." They spurred their horses, the wind now whipping Nell's hair across her face and tearing at her clothes. The air grew colder with each passing second. They reached the shack, a small, rough-hewn box of a building. Just as the first pellets of ice began to fall, they were small at first, pinging off the dry ground like scattered pebbles. They hastily unsaddled the horses and led them into a small lean-to attached to the back of the building. By the time they stumbled inside the shack and barred the door, the world outside had dissolved into a roaring, chaotic whiteness. The hailstones were the size of acorns now, then walnuts. They struck the tin roof with a deafening, percussive rhythm, a relentless, angry drumming that sounded like 1,000 gavels calling a terrifying court to order. Inside the small, dusty space, the noise was all-consuming. There was nothing but a crude bunk, a rusted stove, and a small stack of firewood. Asa worked quickly, his movements efficient. He stuffed dry kindling into the stove and, with a spark from his flint, brought a small, welcome flame to life. Nell stood shivering, wrapping her arms around herself, more from the shock of the storm's sudden violence than the cold. Asa pulled a thick wool blanket from the bunk. It was worn and smelled of dust and pine. He didn't say a word, just draped it around her shoulders. His fingers brushed her neck, a brief, warm touch that sent a shiver through her for an entirely different reason. He found a dented coffee pot and a small sack of beans, and soon the smell of coffee began to fill the small space, a warm, civilized scent battling the elemental fury outside. He poured the steaming liquid into 2 tin cups. They drank in silence for a few minutes, listening to the thunderous assault on the roof. The small stove pushed back the chill, and the blanket, which Asa had insisted she keep wrapped around her, was a cocoon of warmth. "I've never seen anything like it," Nell said, her voice barely a whisper against the roar. "It happens," Asa replied, staring into the flames visible through the stove's small grate. "The mountains make their own weather. They don't much care what men are planning to do down below." His words hung in the air, weighted with a meaning that went beyond the storm. In the close confines of the shack, with the world outside erased by the hailstorm, The walls they kept between them seemed to be dissolving. "That night your men came to the school," Nell began softly. I was afraid of what you might do." He didn't look at her, but she saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. "You had reason to be?" His voice was low and rough. "There's a part of me that knows how to end a fight like that. Quick and final. I've spent a long time keeping that man on a tight leash." He took a sip of his coffee. "The war teaches you how to survive. It doesn't teach you how to live after." And then there was a dispute. Years ago, over water. Same as this. A man drew on me. I was faster. The law said I was right, but it never felt right. Taking a life, even when you have to, it leaves a mark, a stain you can't ever wash out. It was the most he had ever spoken of his past. Nell's heart ached for him, for the burden he carried in such silence. She understood now that his solitude was not a preference, but a penance. "I know something of stains that won't wash out," she said, her own voice quiet. "In Boston, I was a teacher at a prestigious school. One of the patrons, a wealthy, powerful man, took an interest in me, an unwelcome one. When I rebuffed him, and then reported his conduct, he told everyone that I had been the one pursuing him, that I was unstable. It was his word against mine. A school teacher against a man who funded half the city. They dismissed me. The shame followed me everywhere. It's why I left. It felt like I was marked." She had never told anyone the full story. Saying the words aloud in the roaring darkness of the line shack felt like lancing a wound. Asa finally turned to look at her, his whiskey-colored eyes holding a deep and solemn understanding. He saw not a fallen woman, but a fellow survivor. "That's not a stain. Nell," he said, his voice gentle, "that's a scar. You get them fighting for what's right." The storm raged on, but inside the shack, the air had cleared. The space between them was no longer an awkward distance, but a shared ground of understanding. He reached out and pulled a corner of the blanket he'd given her, tucking it more securely around her shoulder. Their hands met, his calloused and strong, hers trembling slightly. He didn't let go. They sat there for a long time, sharing the warmth of the fire and the fragile comfort of their confessed truths, while the storm hammered out its judgment on the world outside. When the hail finally stopped, the silence was as sudden and shocking as the noise had been. The drumming on the roof ceased, replaced by the sound of water dripping and running in countless rivulets. When Asa opened the door, the world was transformed. The ground was covered in a thick, white blanket of ice, and the air was sharp and clean. The storm had passed as quickly as it had come. Their ride back was slow and treacherous. The ground was a slush of mud and melting ice. As they neared the ranch, they heard a new sound, a low roar that was not the gentle voice of Willow Draw. It was an angry, churning noise. They crested the final rise and saw it. The storm had been too much for Legrand's shoddy dam. The sheer volume of water and ice had smashed through it. Now, a brown, frothing torrent of water was pouring down the draw, overflowing its banks and spreading across the lower pasture. The stream, normally a few feet across, was now a 50-foot-wide river. Asa's men were scrambling to move the cattle in the nearby corral to higher ground, but Nell's eyes were drawn to a small cluster of tents and wagons downstream, where Legrand's hired workers had made their camp. The floodwater was already swirling around the wagon wheels. People were shouting, trying to salvage their belongings from the rising tide. Then Nell saw it. A small child, no more than 4 years old, had toddled away from his frantic mother and was standing near the water's edge, mesmerized by a wooden toy being swept along by the current. A new surge of water, carrying a broken piece of the dam's timber, crested the bank and knocked the boy off his feet. He disappeared into the churning brown water. Nell's scream was lost in the roar, but Asa had seen it too. Without a moment's hesitation, he spurred his horse. He didn't ride toward his own cattle or his own cabin. He galloped straight for the flood. He plunged the horse into the raging water, leaning low from the saddle. He swept the child up in one strong arm, lifting him from the torrent just as the current was about to pull him under. He fought the horse back to the bank, soaked and covered in mud, and handed the sputtering, terrified boy back to his weeping mother. The woman, the wife of one of Legrand's men, could only stare at him, her face a mask of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. The other workers, who had viewed Asa as their enemy, stood in stunned silence. They had just witnessed a man risk his own life to save the child of his adversary. The floodwaters had not just washed away a dam. They had washed away the lines of allegiance Legrand had so carefully drawn. Just as the chaos began to subside, Deputy Ruth Calder rode up, her horse picking its way carefully through the mud. Her face was grim. She wasn't looking at the flood. She was looking for Asa. "I'm glad I found you. Asa," she said, her voice tight. "We caught one of Legrand's men, a fellow named Cole Burns, trying to set a fire in your hay barn an hour ago." A cold dread settled over Nell, chilling her more than the storm had. "He got to talking," Ruth continued, her eyes hard as stone. "Said the hay was just the start. The plan was to wait for a windy night, set your cabin ablaze, and make it look like a stray spark from your own hearth. Legrand was going to claim you were a careless drunk, a danger to the territory. He wasn't just planning to take your land. Asa, he was planning to burn you out, one way or another." Asa stood beside his horse, dripping water and mud, the rescued child's parents still staring at him with awe. He looked from the broken dam to the clear, cold gaze of the law, and then to Nell, in the clean, storm-washed air. The truth was finally, brutally clear. While Victor Legrand had been plotting with fire and lies in the shadows, Asa McKenna had just walked through water to save a life. His character laid bare for all to see. The night that followed the flood was unnaturally clear and cold. The storm had scoured the sky, leaving it a deep, star-pricked indigo, and a sharp wind swept down from the Organ Mountains, carrying the chill of melted ice. The world felt raw, stripped bare. Every puddle and patch of mud left by the deluge reflected the cold, distant light of the moon. From the window of her small shack, Nell watched the single square of golden light that was Isa's cabin. He was in there, alone with his thoughts. She had seen him after Ruth Calder left, his face a mask of stone. He had worked alongside his men and Legrand's stunned crew, securing what was left of the camp. His movements economical and precise, his voice calm as he gave orders. He had shown no anger, no triumph, only a deep, bone-wearying resolve. But Nell knew what such control cost a man. She knew the silence that followed the storm, both outside and in, could be the most dangerous part. He hadn't eaten. No one had. The day had been torn apart by hail and flood and the jagged truth of Legrand's treachery. Nell felt a familiar, deep-seated need to impose order on chaos. And for her, order began with a warm meal. It was all she had to offer, a small shield against the cold and the darkness. In the small haven of her kitchen, she moved with quiet purpose. She roasted green chiles and tomatillos over the stove's flame until their skins blistered and blackened, filling the room with a smoky, pungent aroma. She chopped onions and garlic, the rhythmic tap of the knife a steadying beat. Soon, a pot of chile verde was simmering, its gentle bubbling a sound of comfort and life. She mixed a batch of cornbread, the simple act of measuring flour and buttermilk a familiar ritual that calmed her own frayed nerves. When the stew was rich and the cornbread was golden, she ladled a generous portion into a heavy bowl, wrapped the bread in a clean cloth, and set it all on a wooden tray. Carrying the tray, she stepped out into the night. The cold air was a shock, biting at her cheeks. She picked her way carefully across the muddy ground, her gaze fixed on the glowing window ahead. This short journey felt different from all the others. She wasn't his cook fulfilling a duty. She was a woman bringing solace to a man she had come to care for, a man whose quiet burdens she now understood as her own. The cabin door was unlatched. She pushed it open softly and stepped inside. The warmth from the hearth fire washed over her. Asa was sitting at the table, not eating, not reading, just staring into the flames, a half-empty coffee cup near his hand. He looked up as she entered, and the deep exhaustion in his eyes made her heart ache. "Nell," he said, his voice rough, "you shouldn't be out. It's cold." "Then you should have a hot meal," she replied simply, setting the tray on the table. The savory scent of the stew filled the cabin, a stark contrast to the scent of wood smoke and stale coffee. He looked at the food, then back at her, a flicker of something vulnerable in his gaze. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. She took his silence as acceptance, pulling the other chair closer to the table and sitting down, a silent statement that he would not be eating alone. He picked up his spoon and took a bite of the stew. A low, involuntary sound of appreciation escaped him. He ate for a few moments in a focused silence, the way a truly hungry man does. Nell waited, content to simply watch the firelight play across the planes of his face. "The men from the camp," he said finally, his voice less strained. "Their families. They'll be heading back to Massilia tomorrow. Legrand's little operation is finished here. For now." "What will happen to them?" Nell asked. "Marisol will see they get a hot meal. The church might help, but they'll move on. They follow the work." He pushed a piece of cornbread through the thick sauce on his plate. "They looked at me today. They looked at me like I wasn't the enemy." "You saved one of their children, Asa," she said softly. "That's a language everyone understands." He fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, less heavy. He was thinking of the boy. She knew, not the flood or the fire that never was. "This cabin," he said after a long while, gesturing with his spoon to the log walls around them. "I built it to be a fortress, a place to keep the world out." He met her eyes across the small table. "You keep bringing the world in, Eleanor Hart, and I'm finding I don't mind so much." "Perhaps you weren't building a fortress," she suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps you were just waiting for the right person to help you build a home." The word hung in the warm air between them. Home. For Nell. It had been a place of shame and loss in Boston, a house of cold parlors and colder whispers. Here, in this rough cabin, sharing a simple meal with this quiet, complicated man. She felt more at home than she ever had in her life. "What is a home to you?" he asked, his gaze direct and searching. She thought for a moment. It's a place you don't have to hide, where you can show your scars, and the other person knows they're a part of you. It's a place where the fire is always warm, even when there's a storm outside." She looked at the stew in his bowl, and there's always enough to share. A slow smile touched his lips, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his rugged face. "I reckon that's as good a definition as any." He finished the last of his meal and pushed the bowl away, his eyes never leaving hers. The fire crackled in the hearth. The wind moaned softly around the corners of the cabin. The whole world seemed to have shrunk to this single, warm room. Nell reached for the wooden spoon resting in the stew pot, a simple, absent motion to stir the cooling contents, before she could lift it to her lips to taste it, a habit from 1,000 moments spent over a stove. His hand covered hers, stopping her. His touch was warm and firm, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around her own. The spoon, coated in a streak of green chili sauce, was trapped between their hands. He leaned forward, his face close to hers, his voice a low, intimate whisper that was meant only for her. "You taste better than dinner." The words went through her not as sound, but as heat. It was the most profound compliment she had ever received. A raw and honest declaration that his hunger for her presence, for her very being, was greater than any physical need. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the steady beat of his pulse through his thumb, resting on her wrist. He gently took the spoon from her grasp and set it aside, his hand returning to find hers again. He stood, drawing her up from her chair until she was standing before him, His other hand came up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The gesture was infinitely tender. He wasn't the hard, solitary rancher anymore, nor the fearsome soldier from his past. He was just a man, looking at a woman with a truth in his eyes so clear it stole her breath. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of reckless passion, but of deep, reverent discovery. It was warm and firm, tasting of coffee and wood smoke and a longing that had been held in check for far too long. Nell leaned into him, her hands coming to rest on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. It felt like coming home. When he finally drew back, his forehead rested against hers. "When this is over," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "When the court decides and your letters have done their work, I'll ask you properly, like a man ought to, not in the shadows, but in the daylight, for all to see." It was a promise, more binding than any law, more precious than any deed. It was the promise of a future, a home, a life built together. Nell could only nod, her throat too tight for words, her heart too full. He walked her back to her shack, his hand a warm, protective presence on the small of her back. At her door, he paused, his eyes lingering on her face as if memorizing it. "Lock your door tonight." "Nell," he said softly, and then he was gone, a tall shadow melting into the moonlit darkness. Inside, she leaned against the closed door, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the kiss, of his promise. A dizzying, incandescent joy bloomed in her chest. She turned and looked out her small window, back toward his cabin. She could just make out his silhouette as he stood for a moment, looking back toward her, before going inside. Her gaze drifted downward. The moonlight was bright on the dark, damp earth, and then she saw it, partially hidden in the shadow of a juniper bush. Not on any path, was a shape in the mud. It was a footprint, deep and clear, made by a heavy, worn-down boot. It was not Asa's. It was too close to her own window, in a place where no one had any business standing, a place where someone could watch, unseen. The warmth in her veins turned to ice. The joy in her heart was pierced by a shard of fear. They had not been alone. Their private, fragile moment had been spied upon. The cold wind rattling the window pane suddenly sounded like a threat, a whisper of the danger that was still out there, circling in the dark, waiting. The discovery of the footprint left a residue of fear that clung to Nell like frost. Every gust of wind against her small shack sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to hold a watching figure. The intimacy she had shared with Asa felt both precious and terrifyingly fragile. A small candle flame in a vast, encroaching darkness. 2 days passed in this state of high alert, a tense quiet that felt more like the drawing of a bowstring than any kind of peace. The breaking point came not with a whisper, but with a roar. It was in the gray, liminal hour before dawn that she was jolted from a restless sleep. A strange, flickering orange light danced against her window pane, and the air, usually so clean and sharp, was thick with the acrid smell of smoke. She threw open her door and her heart seized. The great hay barn, the repository of a season's hard labor and the key to the herd's survival through winter, was a roaring inferno against the dark sky. Shouts echoed across the ranch as Asa and his men, already awake and moving, battled the blaze. Nell ran, pulling on her boots, her mind numb with shock. The heat was a physical blow, driving her back. Men formed a frantic bucket brigade from the stream, their efforts a pitifully small answer to the fire's insatiable hunger. The cattle, terrified by the light and the noise, screamed from their corral. And then, through the chaos, came help from the most unexpected quarter. A half-dozen men, running from the direction of the workers' camp downstream, joined the bucket line without a word. It was the father of the boy Asa had saved, and his friends. They had seen the glow in the sky and had come, not as Legrand's hirelings, but as neighbors. They fought the fire with a desperate energy, their faces grim in the demonic, dancing light. They saved the main cabin and the bunkhouse, but the hay barn was a lost cause. As the sun rose, its clean light revealing the full scope of the devastation. A pillar of black smoke climbed into the morning sky. The barn was a blackened skeleton, half of their winter feed. The ranch's life insurance had turned to ash. The men stood, exhausted, smoke-stained, and silent, their faces etched with the grim knowledge of what this loss meant. It was into this scene of weary defeat that Victor Legrand chose to make his entrance. He rode up not on a workhorse, but on a fine bay mare, accompanied by the town's sheriff, a man known to be friendly to the railroad's interests. Legrand's suit was immaculate, his face a mask of polite, predatory concern. He held up a document with a flourish. "A terrible accident. McKenna," he said, his voice carrying an oily slick of false sympathy. "It seems you have trouble keeping this place safe. This injunction from the territorial court grants me temporary control of the Willow Draw waterway, effective immediately, pending a final hearing. Given this unfortunate event, the court agrees that the resource must be managed by a more responsible party." Asa, his face smeared with soot, his eyes red from smoke and exhaustion, took a step forward. For a moment, Nell was certain the barely leashed violence inside him would finally break free. But he stopped. He looked at the faces of his men, at the faces of the workers who had come to his aid, and then at Nell. He seemed to draw strength from them. "The circuit judge is due in Massilia in 2 days, Asa said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "We'll see what he has to say about your piece of paper, Legrand." The makeshift courtroom in Massilia's town hall was packed. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and nervous anticipation. An entire season of hope and hardship was to be decided here, under the stern gaze of Judge Isaac Parker, a man whose face looked as though it had been carved from granite. Legrand's lawyer, a slick talker from Santa Fe, presented his case with confidence. He spoke of progress, of the railroad as the engine of civilization. He unrolled Legrand's map, a pristine, professionally drafted document, and presented it as unimpeachable fact. "The survey is clear. Your Honor, the land, and therefore the water, belongs to the railroad. Mr. McKenna is a squatter, and as recent events have shown, a negligent one at that." When it was Asa's turn, his local lawyer, a man more accustomed to property deeds than corporate warfare, seemed outmatched, but his strategy was not to fight on Legrand's terms. "Your Honor," he said, "we contend that this map is a falsehood, and we have witnesses who can prove it." His first witness was Ezra Pike. The old bounty hunter ambled to the stand, looking entirely out of place. Legrand watched him with a dismissive smirk. Ezra was sworn in, his gnarled hand resting on the Bible. "Mr. Pike," the lawyer began, "you have some familiarity with the surveys of this territory." "I do," Ezra rasped, "and I have some familiarity with Mr. Legrand here." The lawyer nodded. "Please explain." Ezra turned his pale, watery eyes on Legrand. Years back, there was another water dispute. A rancher named Calloway was in a standoff with a man hired to provoke him. That man was Asa McKenna. Calloway went for his gun, and Mr. McKenna was forced to defend himself. Calloway died. He paused, letting the courtroom hang on his words. "I was a bounty man then. I looked into it. The man who hired the fellow to pick that fight, the man who paid him to push Calloway into drawing his gun, was the same man who stood to get Calloway's water rights if he was gone." Ezra raised a trembling, accusatory finger. That man was Victor Legrand. A collective gasp went through the room. Legrand shot to his feet. "This is an outrageous lie, a baseless accusation from a drunken relic. I am under oath, Mr. Legrand," Ezra said calmly. "Are you?" He then turned back to the judge. "And this new map of his, it's a clever fake. It's based on an old Fort Selden patrol map, but he's moved the survey markers. He's shifted the whole grid 2 miles west on paper to put Willow Draw right in his pocket. Legrand's lawyer was sputtering objections, but the judge silenced him with a sharp rap of his gavel. The first crack had appeared in Legrand's polished facade. "Our next witness," Asa's lawyer announced, "is Thomas Vega." A hush fell as Thomas, looking small and terrified, walked to the stand. He clutched a sheaf of papers in his hand, his knuckles white. Nell's heart hammered against her ribs. She had spent the last 2 days drilling him, but this was a pressure cooker she could not have prepared him for. "Son," the judge said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "what is it you have there?" Thomas swallowed hard. It's our survey, sir." He looked to Nell, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. He took a deep breath, and his voice, though trembling, grew clearer. "Miss Hart, our teacher, she taught us how to use a compass and a surveyor's chain. Deputy Calder showed us how to read the county records for the original landmarks." He unfurled their crude, hand-drawn map, its edges smudged with dirt. "We spoke to the old families. We measured from the Sleeping Dog Rock, the real marker. According to our measurements, Willow Draw is squarely on Mr. McKenna's land." Legrand's lawyer laughed out loud. "Your Honor, are we truly accepting the scribblings of a schoolboy as evidence?" "There's more," Tomas said, his voice gaining strength. He held up a thick, leather-bound ledger. My mother, Doña Marisol, she keeps a journal. She has for 20 years. She writes down everything. When the rains come, how high the stream gets." He opened the book and ran his finger along a page of elegant, faded script. "For 20 years, she has recorded the flow of Willow Draw. It has never run dry. It has always been here. It cannot belong to a railroad that only arrived last year." He placed the community's survey and his mother's journal on the judge's bench. He looked at the lawyer, his fear replaced by a quiet, unshakable dignity. One of his hands was stained with soot from the fire, the other coated in a faint layer of white chalk dust. In that moment, he held both the ashes of their loss and the knowledge that was their only hope. Judge Parker was silent for a long time, looking from Legrand's perfect, sterile map to the boy's earnest, smudged drawing in the old, worn journal filled with a generation of life. He looked at the testimony of Ezra Pike. He looked at the letters on his desk from a teacher and a bishop, speaking of a school kitchen for the community. "This court," the judge declared, his voice booming through the silent room, "finds that there is significant doubt as to the validity of the plaintiff's survey. Furthermore, it recognizes the establishment of a community school and provisioning center at the location in question. Therefore, this court places a temporary stay on the injunction. Willow Draw will be considered a public trust, managed by Mr. McKenna, pending a full and proper territorial survey." It was a victory. Stunned, joyous murmurs filled the room. Legrand stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. His perfect plan had been undone by a ghost from his past and a schoolboy. But his day was not over. As he turned to leave, Deputy Ruth Calder stepped into his path. She held up a warrant. "Victor Legrand," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'm placing you under arrest on the charge of conspiracy to commit arson." "This is absurd," Legrand blustered. "We have a signed confession from your man, Cole Burns," Ruth stated calmly. "And after the fire at Mr. McKenna's ranch 2 nights ago, he decided to tell us even more. He's ready to testify that you hired him, and others, for both crimes." The sheriff, who had accompanied Legrand, now looked pale and backed away slowly. The town was witnessing the dramatic fall of a man they had believed to be untouchable. As Ruth took Legrand's arm to lead him away, his eyes, burning with a venomous hatred, found Asa and Nell. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low and full of menace. "You haven't won. I'll get what's mine, if not with paper, then with blood." He was led away, leaving his threat hanging in the air like the lingering smell of smoke. The battle for Willow Draw had been won, but his final promise was a chilling reminder that the roots of hate, like the desert scrub, ran deep, and were hard to kill. The victory in the courtroom was a fragile thing, a temporary shield against a storm that had not yet passed. Legrand was in a cell, but his parting words had been a poisoned dart, and the venom of it, the threat of blood, lingered in the air. As the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows from the skeletal remains of the burned barn, a new and unfamiliar spirit took hold at Willow Draw. The men who had fought the fire side by side Asa's hands, and the families who had worked for Legrand, now stood together in the deepening twilight, their shared ordeal having burned away old allegiances. There was no talk of leaving. By unspoken consensus, a vigil was formed. They were not just guarding against another fire, they were guarding the verdict, guarding the fragile idea that their small, collective voice had mattered. Lanterns were hung around the perimeter of the surviving barn, the one that served as their schoolhouse. Men took up positions in the shadows, armed with rifles and a quiet, weary determination. It was a community drawing a line in the dirt, a circle of light against the vast, uncertain darkness. Inside this circle, Nell saw a different kind of need. The women and children of Legrand's former crew were huddled near a small campfire, their faces etched with uncertainty. They were jobless, their protector jailed, their future a terrifying blank. They were the collateral damage in a war they hadn't chosen. Looking at their tired, anxious faces, Nell felt no triumph, only a deep, aching compassion. Vengeance would not rebuild a barn or feed a hungry child. She went to Doña Marisol, who had ridden out from Mesilla with supplies and a fierce, maternal resolve. Together, they marshaled their resources. They set the largest cast-iron pot they could find over the main campfire. Into it went cornmeal, water, and milk, stirred with a paddle-sized wooden spoon. Soon, the simple, wholesome scent of atoll, a warm corn porridge, began to weave through the lingering smell of ash. It was a scent of sustenance, of comfort, of life carrying on. Nell ladled the steaming porridge into every bowl that was offered. She served Jesse and Nate, and then she turned and served the wife of the man Asa had rescued from the flood. The woman met her eyes, her own filled with a hesitant gratitude that was more eloquent than any words. Nell saw the children, their faces smudged with dirt and worry, eat with a quiet intensity. In the flickering firelight, the lines between victor and vanquished blurred and then vanished, replaced by the simple, human truth of a shared meal. They were all just people, caught in the gears of a rich man's ambition, trying to survive the night. Asa watched her from a distance. He saw the way she moved among the families, her presence a calm and reassuring warmth. He saw her offer a bowl to the mother of the man who had tried to burn down his home, and he saw the woman accept it. He was witnessing an act of grace so profound it humbled him. She was not just fighting for land or water. She was building a community from the ground up, with the most basic and powerful tools of all, food and forgiveness. Later, as the night deepened and a cold moon rose, a sense of exhaustion settled over the camp. Most of the women and children had bedded down in the bunkhouse, offered freely by Asa's men. The guards changed shifts, their voices low murmurs in the dark. Thomas, his heart still soaring with the pride of his day in court, was helping Nell clean the great pot by the firelight. He felt a new confidence, a sense of his own worth that was as bright and clear as the letters he could now read. It was this newfound confidence that made him careless. He carried a bucket of rinse water away from the fire, toward the shadows at the edge of the camp, whistling a soft tune. The attack came with the silent, brutal speed of a striking snake. A figure detached itself from the deeper darkness behind the corral. It was Cole Burns, released from custody with a warning and burning with the humiliation of his confession. He had circled back, driven by a twisted need to reclaim some measure of his pride. He wasn't after Asa. He was after the source of his shame, the boy whose testimony had sealed his fate. Burns lunged, a knife flashing in the moonlight. He grabbed Thomas by the shirt, spinning him around, the blade coming up. You and your little blackboard, he snarled, his voice a venomous whisper. Nell screamed. But Asa was already moving. He had been watching the shadows, his instincts honed by years of paying attention to the things that moved in the dark. He had seen the flicker of motion that didn't belong. He launched himself forward, covering the distance in 3 long strides. He didn't have time to draw his pistol. He slammed into Burns, his shoulder hitting the man square in the chest. The force of the impact sent both men sprawling. The knife flew from Burns's hand, skittering across the dirt. Tomas scrambled backward, his face a mask of terror. Burns was wiry and quick. He rolled to his feet and threw a wild punch, but Asa was already inside his guard. It wasn't a fight, it was a containment. Asa subdued him with a cold, efficient violence, pinning him to the ground with a knee on his chest. His forearm pressed against the man's throat until the fight went out of him. "Get the deputy." Asa grunted to one of his men who had come running at the sound of the scuffle. He looked over at Tomas, who was being comforted by a shaken but steady Nell. "You all right, son?" Tomas could only nod, his eyes wide. Nell rushed to Asa's side as the others hauled the defeated Burns away. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her hands fluttering over him, checking for injury. "It's nothing," he said, but then he winced as he pushed himself to his feet. In the lantern light, she saw a long, dark slash along his left forearm where the knife, in its initial arc, had caught him. It wasn't deep, but it was bleeding freely. She tore a strip from her petticoat without a second thought, her movements sure and practiced. She cleaned the wound with water from a canteen and bound his arm tightly, her touch gentle but firm. He stood perfectly still, watching her face, the fierce concentration in her brow, the way the firelight caught the escaped wisps of her hair. He had put his body between the boy and the blade, between the future and the venomous past. And she was here now, mending him. The next morning, the sun rose on a changed world. The attack had been a final, desperate spasm of the old order. When Deputy Calder rode Burns back to a more secure cell in Mesilla, a new sense of purpose had settled over the collection of small ranchers and homesteaders who had gathered at Willow Draw. The ordeal had forged them into something new. They met by the stream, its water flowing clear and free now that the last remnants of Legrand's dam had been washed away. An old rancher, the one who had first told Nell of the sleeping dog Ruck, acted as their spokesman. "Asa," he said, his voice heavy with the gravity of the moment. "We were afraid. We let you stand alone for too long, but what happened here, with the fire, in the courtroom, it belongs to all of us now. This water is for all of us." Another man spoke up. "We want to form a cooperative, a water association. We'll all pay a share for the upkeep of the draw. We'll draw up a schedule, so everyone gets their fair share in the dry season. But it means you'd have to give up your sole claim." It was an audacious request. They were asking him to share the very thing he had nearly killed and died for. The Asa of a year ago, the solitary man in his fortress, would have sent them packing, but he was not that man anymore. He looked at the faces before him, earnest, hopeful, and finally, courageous. He looked at Nell, standing beside him, his bandaged arm a testament to the new allegiances he had forged. He was no longer just protecting a piece of land. He was part of a community. "Drop the papers," Asa said, his voice clear and steady. "I'll sign." That afternoon, on the tailgate of a wagon, with a dozen dusty homesteaders looking on, Asa McKenna signed the document that turned his private water source into a public trust. As he straightened up, he felt not a sense of loss, but a lifting of a great weight. He had shared the burden, and in doing so, had made his own claim stronger than ever before. That evening, the quiet that settled over the cabin was one of deep, abiding peace. The vigil was over. The future, while not without its challenges, was no longer a threat, but a promise. Nell brought him his supper, and they ate in a comfortable silence, the unspoken understanding between them a tangible presence in the room. Afterward, He led her out onto the small porch. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. The sky was awash with a sea of stars. He took her hand, the one that had bandaged his arm, and held it in his own. "I made you a promise," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and I mean to keep it. The judge will make his ruling permanent in a few months, and Legrand will face his own trial. It's not over yet, not officially." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring. It was a plain band of silver, unadorned, its surface gleaming softly in the moonlight. It was not a ring of wealth or status. It was a ring of substance, solid and true. "But this," he said, his voice growing thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "this is for right now. This is my promise to you, Eleanor Hart, a promise that my home is your home, that my future is our future." He slid the cool, smooth metal onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Nell looked from the ring, a circle of light on her hand, to his face, in his eyes. She saw the end of her long journey. She saw safety. She saw respect. She saw a love as sturdy and as elemental as the mountains behind them. "When the ink is dry on all the papers," he said, his hand closing over hers, "I will marry you, in the daylight, for all to see." "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of all her hopes and all her history. "Yes, Asa." He drew her into his arms, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. The silver ring on her finger was a small, cool anchor in the warm, dark night, a simple, perfect promise of the life that was to come. The seasons turned with the slow, deliberate grace of the desert. The harsh memory of the hailstorm and the flood gave way to the steady, baking heat of a New Mexico summer. The water in Willow Draw, now the shared lifeblood of a dozen families, ran clear and constant. Under the agreement Asa had signed, a spirit of careful cooperation took root. Men who had once viewed each other as rivals now consulted on when to draw water. Their conversations about irrigation schedules slowly turning to talk of cattle prices and the health of their children. The first corn harvest since the Troubles was not a bountiful one. The fire had taken its toll, and the early season drought had left its mark. But it was enough. The stalks were sturdy, the ears full, if not oversized. As they brought in the harvest, a quiet sense of triumph settled over the community. They had faced down a corporation, a corrupt council, and the fury of nature itself, and they had endured. The sight of the communal grain wagon, filled with the fruits of their shared labor, was a more potent symbol of their victory than any court document. The barn, once a mere shelter for animals and then a fledgling school, had blossomed into the true heart of Willow Draw. It was a school, yes, but it was also so much more. On Tuesday evenings, Nell taught the basics of reading and writing to the men and a growing number of women. On Thursdays, armed with day-old newspapers from Messilia, it became a reading circle, where Tomas, his voice now clear and confident, would read the territorial news aloud to those who could not yet read it themselves. On Saturday afternoons, it became a kitchen school, where Nell and Doña Marisol taught the younger women how to preserve vegetables and the best way to make a stew stretch to feed 10 mouths instead of 5. It even became a place of business. Nell, using her neat teacher's script, showed the ranchers how to keep ledgers, how to calculate profits and losses, transforming their hard work from a gamble into a calculated enterprise. The building still smelled of hay and horse, but now it was layered with the scents of chalk dust, brewing coffee, and the boundless potential of the human mind. News of Victor Legrand came in trickles from Messilia, the railroad, facing a public relations disaster and the prospect of a lengthy, expensive trial with an honest judge. Swiftly cut its ties. They issued a formal withdrawal of their claim on Willow Draw, citing a regrettable surveying error. Left without his corporate backing, Legrand's power evaporated. Faced with the sworn testimony of Ezra Pike, Cole Burns, and a half-dozen others, he was convicted of conspiracy and fraud. but the territory's jails were rough places, and a man with a little remaining money could still pull strings. His sentence was shorter than it should have been. One day, a freight driver brought the news that Legrand had been released and had taken the morning stage east, a bitter, diminished man who had vanished back into the anonymity of the wider world. There was no celebration at the news, only a quiet, collective sigh of relief. The shadow had passed. The day of the wedding arrived with the autumn light, crisp and golden. There was no church, no fancy carriage. The ceremony was held in the open air, on a small rise overlooking the life-giving stream, with the jagged peaks of the Organ Mountains standing as silent, eternal witnesses. The entire community was there, their faces scrubbed clean, their best clothes worn and mended. The women had woven wildflowers into wreaths, and a long trestle table groaned under the weight of covered dishes, a testament to the harvest they had all brought in together. Doña Marisol sat on a stool, her fingers, usually busy with dough or a ledger, now dancing across the strings of an old guitar, playing a soft, sweet melody that spoke of love and homeland. Deputy Ruth Calder stood beside the makeshift altar, a flat-topped rock, her badge gleaming on her vest. She was not just an officer of the law. She was a friend, her presence a symbol of the true, impartial justice they had fought so hard to find. Tomas, dressed in a clean shirt that was a little too big for him, stepped forward. He held no paper. He spoke from the heart, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the quiet crowd. When Miss Hart first came here, he began, looking at Nell. I knew only the work of my hands. I did not know that the letters on a page could be tools, too stronger than a shovel, stronger than a fence post. She and Mr. McKenna, they taught us that a community is not just a collection of houses. It is a place where we stand up for each other, where we share our water, and where we share our knowledge. He looked out at the assembled faces. Today is a good day. It is a day for kindness, for knowledge, and for love. Asa stood waiting. His usual reserve melted away, leaving only a deep, profound happiness in his eyes. He watched Nell walk toward him, escorted by no one but her own quiet courage. She wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, the same color as the desert sky after a storm, and in her hair was a sprig of purple verbena. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Their vows were simple and direct, spoken to each other rather than to the crowd. They were not promises of ease or riches, but of steadfastness, a promise to be a warm fire in the storm, to be a safe harbor, to be a home. When Asa slid the plain silver ring, now polished to a bright gleam, onto her finger next to the one she already wore, it felt less like a beginning and more like a confirmation of a truth that had existed between them for a long time. Ruth Calder pronounced them husband and wife, and the small crowd erupted in a cheer that echoed off the mountains. That night, the cabin was quiet. The last of the well-wishers had departed, their laughter fading into the darkness. A warm fire danced in the hearth, casting a soft, golden glow on the log walls. For the first time, Nell was not a guest here, not a cook, not a visitor. She was home. She was unpacking the small trunk that held her few belongings, her books, her mother's faded handkerchief, the simple clothes that had seen her through so much. Asa came and stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the fire. That was a fine speech Tomas gave, he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He's a fine young man, Nell replied, leaning back against the solid strength of him. He wants to be a teacher someday. We'll need a proper schoolhouse then, Asa said, as if it were the most natural thought in the world. Not just the barn. We could build one, right here on this rise, with real glass windows. Nell turned in his arms to face him. She looked at his dear, familiar face, the lines around his eyes no longer speaking of caution, but of a deep and settled peace. She touched the faint scar on his forearm, a reminder of the night he had stood between innocence and hate. "A school," she said softly, the idea taking root in her heart. "A real one." "And we'll need to add on to this cabin," he continued, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "A bigger kitchen. For a start. For all the meals you'll be cooking." She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She lifted her hand, the silver ring catching the firelight. "I think," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable joy, "that this kitchen is just the right size. For now." He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss of profound tenderness, a silent seal on all the promises spoken and unspoken. Outside, the vast desert was dark and silent, and the stars were a cold, brilliant fire in the endless sky. The world was still a hard place, full of uncertainty and struggle. But here, inside the sturdy walls of the small cabin, two people had built a fortress not of wood and stone, but of courage, kindness, and a love that had been tested and proven true. Here, they had built a home. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love for you to comment where you're listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.